Okay, everyone, so now we've done our main form and in the last video. So now what we're going to do is we need to introduce some kind of security into the system. We don't want anybody just logging onto the system. Now, to do that, let's just quickly log into SQL Plus and see what we can use. Because, I mean, what are the basics of security? One, we need to have some kind of username. Two, we need some kind of security feature like a password. And three, if we want to restrict or limit access in some way, we need to be able to actually determine user rights. So, for example, an administrator can do this, systems analysts can do this. Whatever is the case, whatever your business rules are, and whatever your rules are around your data access needs to be implemented in your system. Okay, so let's see. So in the faculty table, if I describe the faculty table, that's who we're going to log on to the system. So a lecturer will be able to log on. We have a unique identifier for a lecturer, so we have our FID. We have a PIN number for that lecturer, so we have some kind of security feature like a PIN number, and we have some kind of rank. So let's just look at the values that we see there. So if I say, let's say select FID, let's just put the names so that we can see them as well. If last and if rank, if PIN from faculty. Well, let's just change our environment settings quickly just so that we can see everything in one line. So I'm just going to increase it to 200, increase the buffer width to 200, and we're just going to redo this query. Excuse me. Okay, so there we have our lecturers. We have their ID. We have whether they're an associate, an assistant, or a full. So basically an assistant professor or lecturer is the lowest. Then we get our associate professor or lecturer, and then we get a full professor or lecturer. And these are the pins for each of these. Okay, so that's what we need to remember. So very quickly, let's quickly create not a search. Let's just use WordPad, and then we can at least get this information in there. Okay, now let's say that our business has specific rules about data access, right? So we have 4 forms at the moment, if you remember, right? We have the advisor form, the location form, the registration form, and the student form. So we have the advisor form, we have the location form, we have the registration form, and we have the student form. Okay, now if we make our rules for this, so let's say the advisor form, right, needs to be accessed by only a full professor. So only the full professor can access it because they are assigning students to lecturers, right? Then we have our location form. So now let's say our location form should be accessed by the full professor as well as the associate professor, right? So location in this case is things like classrooms and offices. And let's say the associate professor is the one and the full professor to allocate offices and venues and things like that. Okay, the registration form should be accessible by the associate professor, the full professor, as well as the assistant professor. So normal registration of a student can be done by any three of those, right? And the student form, so to look up or enter student information, can be accessed by any of these, any of them again, to be able to do that, right? So you will see in this case, the full professor is like an admin because they have access to all 4 forms. An associate professor has access to 3 of the forms, and the assistant professor only has access to 2 of the forms. Okay, so let's go. So now I have my main form, and we're going to leave this open so that we can sort of go between forms so you can see what exactly is happening. So I'm going to select forms and I'm going to create a new form. And just to make it easier, I'm just going to move it, or rather, let's move this one down, just so that I'm working on this. Why isn't this working? Very strange. Okay, but this one is going to be my login form. Right. Very strange. Well, let me cheat a little. So I'm going to close the main form. I haven't made any changes to it. And then I can open the main form again, just so that it appears as the second form. It just makes it easier. Okay, so there's the main form. Okay, so we have our login form, and again, it is completely empty, and it has a window. Okay, so this one I'm going to turn into my login win. Okay, so remember, there's no login table in the database. So it's not as if we can create a data block that is magically connected using the wizard to a particular table in the database. And we can't connect it to the faculty table because if you connect your fields to the faculty table, then using the built-in controls, you're going to be able to look up lecturer information on the login form using the query mode button, which is not what we want. So once again, a login form is a custom form. You're not necessarily going to connect it to anything in the database. We will get information from the database if we need it using code. Okay, so here under the data blocks, I'm going to manually create a data block. This is going to be my login, my login block. And I'm going to create a canvas, and this is going to be my login canvas. Okay, so now I can right click and I can bring up the layout editor, and there it is. And believe it or not, this is actually quite big for a login form for the system. We actually need a much smaller form. So again, just to make it look good, I'm going to import my logo. So there's my logo, and all a login form needs is 3 items. Okay, so all I need is 3 items. What are those items? I need 1 text box for the user to enter their username. I need 1 text box for the user to enter their password, or PIN in this case. And then I need 1 button where all the magic is going to happen. Okay, so this one, it'll be my username. I'll just leave it as username. This one will be my PIN, and this one will be my login button. Okay, So let's give these, okay, first of all, let's just align the edges to make it look better. And if I go to the properties of this text box and I scroll down, what you're looking for is the prompt property. So the prompt will be the label that attaches to itself. Here I can put the username and I'm going to center it. So you'll see now that it's got the label username. I select the pin now. There I'm working with the pin. I scroll down. I tell a little too far. So here I put the pin prompt and I'm going to center it. So there we have it. And here I'm going to select, I'm going to change this to login, the label. And that's it. That's all we actually need. Now, where it gets interesting is here. So on my login button, I'm going to use a when button press trigger. There it is. And what I need to do is I need to basically take whatever the user has typed in as their username. I need to actually, whatever the user has typed in as their username, in this case it'll be their FID, I need to then ask or use a select statement to read the pin out of the database. And then I need to compare the pin that the user types in here to the pin that the database is telling me is correct. If it matches, allow the user to log in. If it does not match, don't allow the user to log in. Okay, so you need to be very careful there. So we're going to use various things. So look at what I'm going to do now. I'm going to declare, and I'm going to declare vpin, right? And now vpin is going to be a variable that's going to hold the value of the pin number that it fetches from the database. Now, if we go to the database, if we look back here, do you see vpin was a number, fpin, sorry, for the faculty is a number 4. And that's what we're going, that value is what we're going to put in this. So we can make this now a number and it's 4, right? That's all we need for now. So now I have my begin. Okay, then what do? I say select, and then I say fpin, okay, from faculty, where my faculty.fid is equal to whatever is in the text box in the login block that is called username. So what am I doing here? I'm selecting the pin from the faculty table where the faculty ID is equal to whatever the user typed into the text box, username. But all I'm doing here is selecting the pin. Where does it go? I need to use the into clause. So I'm selecting the pin from the database and inserting it into the variable vpin, which I declared in my declaration section. Right. So now I've done that. I've managed to get a pin number from the database into the variable vpin. So now I'm going to use a conditional statement. So if the value in vpin is equal to whatever the user typed into the text box pin in the login block, do you see that? If it's equal, then what do I want it to do? I want it to call the form. And what form must it call? In my project file, it must call the main form.fmx. Else, if it doesn't call it, what must it do? It must display a message to my user that says the PIN number that you entered is incorrect. Please try again. And that's it. End if. So here, if the PIN that is stored in this variable is equal to the PIN that the user typed, then allow it. It matches. So I call my main form. Else, if there's any other situation, in other words, if it's not the same, display a message to the user, the PIN is incorrect, right? You might even want to clear the form. So use the built-in function to clear the form, and then they have to enter the information again. If I compile this, do you see it works? Let's test it. So if I'm on my login form and I run it now, let's actually test it and see if it is actually working. Okay. Okay, so let's test a user. So if I go back to this information, so if I put in, let's just make this smaller. There we go. So if I put in Teresa Marks, so her FID is 1 and her PIN number is 6338. So you can see there that I've typed it correctly, 6338. I click login. This is the correct PIN number for the correct username. I click login. Look at that. My if statement approved. The condition was true. It goes into the form. If I exit, do you see? We'll deal with that. The information is still there. But let's say I put in the incorrect PIN. Do you see there? 6448. Teresa Marks's PIN is 6338. I click login. Look at what happens. The PIN number that you entered is incorrect. Please try again. And do you see it cleared it? Let's test a different user. So PIN number, username 2 is 1121. I click login. Do you see it works? It's fine. I log in. Amazing. I click exit. If I typed in the incorrect PIN and I click login, do you see it clears it? And it says the PIN number you entered is incorrect. Okay. So you will have seen if I enter the correct PIN, right? And I enter the correct username and the correct PIN, and I log in, it goes into the main form, and you'll see again the main form, the splash screen is working perfectly. I exit, and unfortunately it retained that information. That's not a particularly good security feature. What could we do to make that a little bit better? So here, instead of calling the form first, I will say if the pins in both of these match, then first clear the form and then call my form. So if I do that again, let's grow old together while we wait for the form to run. Okay, now if I put in the password, if I put in the username, and again, let's just double check what the password is, or the PIN number, it's 6338. I click log in, and it works perfectly. The splash screen goes away. If I exit, do you see it's gone? I'm not able to log in, right? I exit. Now, the other one thing you might have said is, but Mr. Da Rocha, even if it clears it, if someone is standing over your shoulder, as I was typing in my PIN number, they could see my PIN number. How can I possibly hide that? If I go and I go to the properties of the PIN number text box there, under functional, do you see there's an option to conceal the data? You just switch that to yes. Now, if I run this form, okay, now I can type in my username, in this case the FID or the staff number, and I type in the 6338, and do you see it replaces the numbers with symbols, with asterisks. But remember, that is just, it's very similar to a format mask. Just because it's showing asterisk doesn't mean that the underlying information, in this case the PIN number of 6338, is not there, because I've put it in correctly and I click log in and it correctly logs in. However, if I had put it in incorrectly, so here I've just typed in 1234 as the PIN and I click log in, it still says the PIN number that you entered is incorrect. Please try again. Okay, so what we've done is we've implemented a very basic form of security. It functions. And if I look here, I've done essentially this. I've implemented that piece of security. But what about this? What about the fact that I want, whenever an associate professor logs in, they shouldn't have access to the advisor form. At the moment, if an associate professor logs in, they have access to everything. An assistant has access to everything, right? So how do I limit that? Depending on who logs in, I want to limit the access. Now, to do that, we need to take a step back and talk about something called global variables. Now, what are global variables? Whenever you do this, right, whenever you declare a variable inside of a trigger, this variable is only available to this particular trigger. It is not available to the preform trigger, for example, on a different form. It is only available to that trigger. If I have to compare it to something you're familiar with, it is very similar to something to Java, where you have your private and your public variables. So a private variable can only be used by that particular method, while a public variable can be used by any method. Or in HTML, you get something called session variables. And a session is when you are busy on one website, when you start on that website to when you end. Even if you move between different pages on that website, your session is still active. So it's storing specific data that can be accessed by any of the web pages you're accessing. That is a global variable. So if you declare a global variable, you are able to actually store a variable and create and store a variable on one page, or one form rather, and still read it in another form. So let me do a fairly simple example. So here in my login form, right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to declare a variable vName, and this is a normal variable, not a global variable. So vName varchar 230 and vSurname varchar 230. And I'm going to declare a vLevel varchar 230. Right. So here, instead of just fetching the pin for the username that they've entered, I am going to fetch the first name of the person logging in. I am going to declare, going to get the last name of the person logging in, and I'm going to get the rank of the user that's logging in. The first name I'm going to insert into vName. The surname I'm going to put into vSurname. And the rank I'm going to put into actually let's call it vRank, just to be consistent. So here, instead of vLevel, let's call it vRank. Okay. So now look at what I'm going to do. I'm going to declare a global variable. Now, global variables are different to normal variables. First, normal variables can only be created in the declaration section, like we've done here. Okay. Global variables are a form-specific type of variable. So, for example, in SQL+, you cannot create a global variable inside the database. You can only do it within a form. And you can only do it between the begin and the end. You cannot create a global variable in the declaration section. Now, the second thing of a variable is whenever you create a variable in the declaration section, you give it a data type, right? And the values that can be stored in that variable are predetermined by that data type. So in vpin number, I cannot store a varchar value. And then thirdly, a variable that you've declared in the declaration section does not need to be initialized, right? I could declare 17 variables here and only use 3, and it will have no effect on the trigger. Okay, so going back to what I just said about the data type, a global variable does not need or you don't, it's not that it doesn't need, you don't specify a data type. So a global variable will accept any value type. It does not care what kind of value you're passing into it. And then in terms of the actual initialization, you cannot declare a global variable and not initialize it. A global variable must always be initialized with a value. So how do I create a global variable? It's very simple. You simply put colon, global, dot, and then you give the variable a name. It's up to you what the name is. So I like to say GV for global variable, and I'm going to say name. Okay, but in this case, I'm going to use full name. So I'm going to create a global variable called full name, and I'm going to initialize it with colon equal. Remember, that's how we initialize variables. And I'm going to say they must take the name from vname. So vname, concatenate with a space, and concatenate then the value that's currently stored in vsurname. So now I've created a global variable where it's going to take, for example, the Teresa that's stored in vname and the marks that's stored in vsurname, and concatenate it into one value with a space in between that says Teresa space marks. Then I'm going to say declare a new global variable, so colon global dot gv rank, and it must be equal to v rank. Whatever value is currently stored in v rank, that's what it must be equal to. If I compile that, it works. Right. Now look at what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the main form. Right. And I'm going to open up the main canvas. So there is my main form. And look at what I'm going to do. Do you see this is two different forms? I'm going to move this picture to the left here a little bit. And now I'm going to create display items. Remember, we've used a display item before. A display item is like a text item or a text box, except it can only display values. Your user cannot click on it and actually enter their own value. So I'm going to create, but again, be very careful. Like in the previous video, do you see I'm on the main canvas, but I'm actually still creating items on the splash block. Remember to switch to the main block. So I'm going to select the display tool. I'm going to set my text back down, and I'm going to create one display item. Do you see there? It creates the display item. I'm going to create a second display item. I'm just going to align them, and this one is going to be my current user, let's say DI display item, and this one is going to be rank display item. So I just go to the properties. I'm going to give each one of them a prompt. Here I'm going to say currently logged on, right, and I'm just going to center it. And for the rank, I'm going to say rank, and I'm going to center it. So here we have a text box that should, or a display box or a display item that should display the name of the person currently logged on, as well as the rank of the person currently logged on. Okay, but how do I read these items? Look at what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the trigger, the preform trigger on my main form, and I am going to say, remember, you can treat your text boxes or display items like they're variables. So you can read from a text box like I did in the previous form and like we did with the sequences and the max+1 method, or you can write to a text box like we did with the sequences and the max+1 method. So I'm going to say in my main block, the display item that is called current user DI must be equal to, do you see that I'm initializing it like a variable, whatever is stored in global GV full name. Remember, this is the exact same global variable that I'm creating when I click the login button on the login form. And then on my main block, the rank DI must be equal to whatever is currently stored in the global variable GV rank. Okay, if I compile that, it compiles fine. Now I've made changes to this form, so I need to compile the module just to make sure that my new FMX here, just to make sure that the main form FMX is created correctly. Okay, now I need to go back to my login form, because remember, the login form with the login button, that's where the global variables get created. If I run my login form, let's just give it a minute again. Oh my goodness. Oh. Okay, so when I enter the information of the user that's busy logging in, okay, so I'm going to log in as user number 1, who is Teresa Marks. She's an associate professor and her PIN number is 6338. So I enter that, 6338. The login button will still be doing everything it was doing before. So it's still going to check the PIN numbers and compare it. And if it's correct, it will let me in. If it isn't, it's going to show me that message. But if it's correct and it lets me in and I click login, there it's logging in. It should also be fetching the name and the rank of that person, putting it into the global variable. And then when the main form loads, the preform trigger must be reading those values from the global variable and actually inserting it into those text boxes, which you can see here. You can see currently logged on is Teresa Marks and her rank is associate. Right. So now we can see how we are creating values on one form and actually carrying over and reading them from another form. If I exit this and go back to the login, and this time I log in as Janelle Brown. So her username is 4 and 8297 is her PIN. I click login. You will see that every single time I log in as a different user, it actually updates the values in the global variable, and the main form reads those values and inserts it into those text boxes, into those display items. Right. Now you might be asking, okay, before we get there, what happens if I go to the main form directly? In other words, I'm not going to come from the login form. I'm just going to run the main form directly without going from the login form to the main form, what is actually going to happen? You will notice immediately the preform trigger is trying to read the values from the global variable GV full name, and it's telling you it does not exist. And then comes up with a second error, variable global GV rank does not exist, and those text boxes are blank. Why? Because I went directly into the main form, and those variables are only created if you go in through the login form and you click the login button. Okay, and remember, as a developer, you'll probably get these errors very commonly. When it's deployed in your company, everybody's going to go through the login screen. So those variables will always be created and you shouldn't be getting any errors. Okay, we're just getting the errors because we're jumping in between forms. So you might be asking, okay, what was the point of that? Why would I want that information carried over? This ties in to something known as an adaptive main form. And then the adaptive main form has to do with these business rules that we have here. So remember, we said a full lecturer can access all 4 forms. An associate can only access the location, the registration, and the student. And the assistant can only access the registration form and the student form. If I go back to the login form, let's just run it again. And I log in as, let's try logging in as Teresa Marks, Mark Zulin, and Colin Langley. We'll first try Mark Zulin because Mark Zulin is a full professor. And as we can see, a full professor has access to all 4 forms. We'll then try to log in as Teresa Marks. She's an associate professor. She should only be able to access 3 forms: location, registration, and student. And then we'll try Colin Langley, who's an assistant professor. He should only access 2 forms, registration and student. He should not be able to access advisor or location. Okay, so let's try it. I'm going to log in as Mark Zulin. So Mark Zulin 1121. I log in. You can see I'm logged in as Mark Zulin. He's a full professor. Do you see he has access to all 4 forms? So I click, there's a form, there's a form, there's a form, there's a form, right? If I exit, now I'm going to log in as Teresa Marks. If I log in as Teresa Marks, she should only be able to access location, registration, and student, not advisor. But look at what happens. Do you see advisor is still active for her? That's a problem. If I exit and I log in as Colin Langley, Colin Langley should only be able to access registration and student. But there he has access to location and to advisor. So these access rights, that's what we're talking about, access rights or user rights. The full is actually working because if I log in as Mark Zulin, I have access to all 4 forms. But associate and assistant are not working. So if the associate logs in, the advisor form should be disabled, and if the assistant logs in, the location and the advisor form should be disabled. How do I do that? Again, I warned you guys in the previous video, we need to go to our preform trigger. If I bring up my help file, we're going to use a built-in, a new built-in procedure. It's actually called SetItemProperty. Okay, so SetItemProperty modifies all instances of an item in a block by changing a specified item property. And the syntax that we use for this is this one. So SetItemProperty, we pass in the item's name that we want to give to change as a varchar 2. We give the property as a number, and then we give the value as either a varchar 2 or a number. It depends on the property that you want to change. Okay, so what does this actually do? Remember, very often what we've been doing is we can right click an item and bring up the property palette, and then we can manually change values for certain properties. However, we can actually manipulate the properties in code by using this SetItemProperty. So in my preform trigger, look at what I'm going to do. I need to, if the person logging in is remember, the full professor is working. They have access to all 4 buttons. But if the person logging in is an associate professor, you need to disable the advisor form. If the person logging in is an assistant professor, you need to disable the advisor form and the location form. Okay. Now, if you've listened to what I'm saying, I'm actually giving away the answer. If the person logging in is this, then do this. If the person logging in is this, then do this. So what are we going to use? We're going to use a conditional statement. So if the value in my global variable GVRank is equal to associate, then, now I want you to look at how I've typed associate. Do you see that associate is actually typed in the exact same case as all the associate values in the database? Be very careful. Remember what I told you guys in class. An associate or a string value, when you're comparing string values, they are case sensitive, right? If I then typed associates with a lowercase a, it would never work because in my database, there is no associate with a lowercase a. So be very careful about that. So if the person that's logging in is an associate, then SetItemProperty. So set_item_property. I need to pass in the value of the item that I want to change. So I want to disable the advisor form button. So what in my main block dot the advisor form FRM btn. Remember, you must get the exact name from your object navigator. On the advisor form button, then the second value I need to pass in is the actual property I want to change. So what property do I want to change? If I just quickly go and look at my property palette, and I look here, immediately what catches my eye under functional is the enabled property. In other words, if the person logging in is an associate professor, the advisor form button, instead of enabled being yes, it should be no. But I can't have it no all the time. I only need to do it with the conditional statement. But how do I know what is the property name that I must pass in here? How do I know what value to set the property to? Unfortunately, in this case, you have to actually go through your help file. So if you go down, you will see further down in your help file under properties, it gives you a list of all the properties that you can affect using the SetItemProperty procedure. And for each of those properties, it tells you what are valid values for that property. So if I scroll up now and I look for the enabled property, that's the one we want to change. The enabled property specifies where the end user should be able to manipulate an item. Valid values are property true or property false. So here, the property I want to change is the enabled property. And remember, it said you must pass in the value of the property as a number. It's not actually a number, but you don't put your string literals surrounding it. And it's current, by default, it's enabled, so the property is true. But this time I want to disable it. So I want to set it to property underscore false. Okay. Then I can say else if, remember the else if is concatenated and the second E is taken away. If my global.gv rank is equal to assistant, and now remember assistant then, and again the case, make sure your case matches, then what did I want to do? I want to disable 2. They should only access registration and students, so I need to disable the advisor as well as the location form. And because I've been using the same naming convention, I can simply copy paste that line of code so there it disables the advisor form, and then I can paste it again, and instead of the advisor form button, I wanted to disable the location form button. And I can immediately end my if. I don't need an else because there's no other value. If I compile this, it compiles, so it's replaced the old mainform.fmx with these new changes. I go back to my login form and I run my login form. Remember, you have to go back to your login form and test this by using the login form, because the login form is the form that's responsible for creating those global variables that will make the adaptive main form work. Okay, so let's just test the full professor first again, just to see if it's still working. So the full professor, Mark Zulin, his pin code is 1121. Let's see. It successfully logs in. I can see there, logged in is Mark Zulin. His rank is full. Do you see? I can click on all 4 buttons. They're still working perfectly fine for the full professor. Right. For Teresa Marks, the associate professor, remember for her, she should only see location, registration, and student, not advisor. Let's try it. So for Teresa Marks, I successfully log in. Do you see Teresa Marks is logged in and she's an associate. So here, something has gone wrong. So she still has access to the advisor button, which should not be the case. Let's test our assistant professor. So 3, Colin Langley, 9871. And you see, he should only have access to registration and student, but here he has access to advisor and location. Something is definitely wrong. Okay, so the nice thing is I can just go back to my login form because all I need to do is make changes. I don't need to close the window because I just need to make changes here. So let's see what could possibly be wrong. So if my global.gv rank is equal to associate, then SetItemProperty main block dot advisor frm underscore btn. Let's double check advisor frm underscore btn. The enable property false. So that looks correct. Else if my global.gv rank is equal to assistant, then set the item property, the main block. Okay, let's just make sure we're compiling everything. It could be that for some reason the main form did not compile. So compile, save. So now let's just test it again. Let's try logging in as Teresa Marks again. Her PIN code is 6338. Ooh. 6338. There we go. Doesn't seem like I compiled. I think I accidentally recompiled the login form last time and not the main form. So do you see now Teresa Marks, when she logs in, she cannot access the advisor form. She can only access location, registration, and student. Okay, if I exit, I'm going to log in as Colin Langley. Now Colin Langley should only be accessing the last 2 forms, which is registration and student. If I log in as Colin Langley, do you see he does not have access to advisor and location, only registration and only student. Okay. If I exit and now I log in again as Janelle Brown. Janelle Brown is a full professor, so she should have access to all 4 forms. Let's just double check if that's still working after the changes I made. There we go. She has access to all 4 of those forms. And that's it, guys. That's it. That's the integration lesson. You've learned how to create a main form. You've learned the splash screen. You've learned how to actually create a login form. And now you learned about global variables, which have a much wider use than what I've shown you. I've shown you a very simple example of what you can use global variables for. Please feel free to YouTube any other videos. There's a lot of content on YouTube. Not all of it is great, but some of it is good. And we've learned about adaptive main forms, so we've improved the security of the system even further. Okay, and that's the end of this lesson. Thank you very much.